Hey guys, welcome to React Front to Back. So this course is really for anybody, whether you're just learning React or you already know it and you just want to build some projects. And those of you that have taken my courses before, you know that I like to teach in a very hands-on way with actual projects. So what I've done is I've broken this course up into 3 separate projects, the first being a feedback app. And in this one, I want to take things really slow because I want this to be a very beginner-friendly course. So I'll be explaining things like components and props, state, all the fundamentals that you really need to understand to build React applications. And then the second project will be a GitHub Finder app where we work with the GitHub REST API to be able to search users, look at their profile. We'll style it with Tailwind. We're also going to use the context API along with reducers and the use context and use reducer hooks. Now the third project is the main one, the biggest one, which is a house marketplace that uses Firebase 9. So users will be able to come to the site, register either with just an email and password or with Google, with their Google account, and they can list apartments or houses either for sale or for rent. They can set a special discounted price to show up on the offers page, and then every listing will have a map of the location, and it'll also have a slider of all the different images. You can upload up to 6 images per listing, and we'll be using Firebase storage for the images. And you'll be able to go to your profile and manage all your listings, so you'll be able to edit and delete them. So it's a pretty good sized project, and we'll be using the latest version of Firebase, which is version 9. We'll be using the latest version of React Router, version 6. So I think it's a great course for both beginners and for people that already know React, where you might just go and do the main project. So hope you guys enjoy it, and let's get started. Alright guys, so if you've ever learned from me before, if you've watched my tutorials or courses, you know that I'm a very hands-on type of teacher. I like to show what's going on in the code by building actual projects and having you code along with me. But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about what React is, why we use it, and a little bit of how it works. So React is a JavaScript library created and maintained by Facebook that's used for building user interfaces. So it's technically a UI library. Now you've probably heard React referred to as a framework more than a library. In fact, I myself call it a framework, and the reason for that is because it's in direct competition with frameworks like Angular, and it does a lot of the same things, and it's used in a lot of the same way. The only difference between React and Angular is that React at its core is only responsible for creating user interfaces. It doesn't have things like a router or an HTTP client built in. However, we have popular packages like React Router DOM, then we have the Fetch API that's already built into the browser. So once you account for some of those things, then it's basically a framework. At least that's my explanation of why we call it a framework. So React gives us a way to build websites and front-end applications and UIs in an organized way with reusable components. So components can include the output, which is basically the HTML. In React, we use something called JSX, and we'll get into that later. The logic, or the JavaScript, and you can also include the styling, or the CSS, within your components as well, which is a little different than the old school way of doing things. Like when I got started with web development, everything was separate. You had your HTML file, you had your CSS file, you had your JavaScript file, and it was all separate. And with React and other front-end frameworks, we do things in kind of a different way, where instead we look at our UI as different components. So the search bar, the header, the footer, each blog post, everything we look at as a component. So we'll be talking about that as we move along through the course. Now, before we move any further, I just want to talk a little bit about what you should know before learning React, or at least what I suggest you should know before jumping into not only React, but any framework. So I'd say you need to learn the basics of JavaScript, including things like data structures, variables, arrays, objects, loops, functions, etc. You should understand the document object model, or the DOM, and how it's structured, and just some basic manipulation with vanilla JavaScript. In my opinion, you should also know about the popular high-order array methods like for each, map, filter, reduce, find, etc. And these are used all over the place in JavaScript. So I think they're super important to understand when working with data and arrays. Arrow functions are really popular in modern JavaScript and really useful. We'll be using them quite a bit. Asynchronous programming in JavaScript and using promises is also really important. Understanding the dot then and dot catch syntax, as well as async await. Also the fetch API, because in many cases you're using React on your front end and you're sending requests to a back-end API, whether it's your own or a third-party API. So knowing fetch is really important. You might also know third-party HTTP clients like Axios. And then NPM, or Node Package Manager, is also important because oftentimes we use third-party packages that we'll be installing with NPM. We also use NPM just to create a new React application. So these things, in my opinion, are essential to know before jumping into any framework. I do have a course called Modern JavaScript from the Beginning that teaches all of this. It will be updated soon, but not much has changed in terms of the fundamentals, so it's all still very relevant. So why learn React? Why not just build all your front ends with just HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript? Well, as I said before, things used to be really messy with no consistency. You'd have everything would be separate. React and frameworks in general have made it much easier to organize our user interfaces or our front ends. And when I say front end, I mean the user-facing website or application, what we see in the browser. One of the main reasons it gives us organization is with reusable components. We look at every website and UI as a set of components. Like I said, the search box, the header, all that stuff is looked at as a component. It allows us to organize our code much better. React is also very flexible. You can use it in many different ways. You can use it for just part of a project if you want. It can be used with mobile apps with React Native. You could use it along with something like Electron and create a desktop application. You now have server-side rendering with Next.js. There's just so many things you can do in so many different ways with the React library or framework. React is also very popular. I'd say it's the most popular front-end framework in the world at this point. There's a ton of big companies using it. If you're looking to find a job, it's a great framework to choose. Since it's so popular and maintained by Facebook, which is one of the largest companies in the world, you have a ton of support. So there's a great community, a huge community around React. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and if you run into problems, it's pretty easy to find help. React also performs very well. It uses something called the virtual DOM, or virtual document object model. We have separate components in the UI that have something called state. And when a component state changes, React basically compares the existing DOM state with what the new DOM should look like, and then it finds the least expensive and most efficient way to update the DOM. So it's very fast and performant. All right, so React is very declarative, and what I mean by that is we write the code that we want, and React is in charge of taking our declared code and performing all of the JavaScript and DOM steps to get us the result that we want. So if we look at this code here, you don't really have to understand React to be able to visualize what this would look like in a browser. So each one of these tags that we're looking at is a component. We have the app itself, then we have a header, an employee search, an employee list, and a footer component. And this is how we embed components. It's similar to just an XML syntax. And components can also have props passed in, which are basically attributes or arguments that can be passed to that component. So here we have a title prop passed into a header component, and it could be just a regular string or any data type as well as a function. The employee list component takes in a prop of employees. In this case, employees is a variable which would most likely include an array of employee objects. Then in employee list, you could iterate through those objects and output each one in its own component. So components and props are really important. We also have something called state that we're going to learn about. And state is basically just data. You can have component level state. For instance, maybe you have a menu component that can be toggled. So you might have an opened and closed state. That only has to do with that single component. Then you have app level state, which is data that's going to be used in multiple components. So for example, the employees that you might fetch from a database, that's probably going to be your app level state that you can use in multiple components. So events are another big part of React because we often have buttons and input fields that fire off some kind of event to make something happen. So I would say that these four things are the building blocks of not only React, but of many front-end frameworks. And if you don't understand any of this right now, that's absolutely fine. The first project, the feedback app, we're going to talk about these 4 things in depth and look at all the syntax to create and use them. So instead of just showing you a bunch of boring slides, we're going to go through everything from within our code. And it's just easier for me to teach that way. And in my experience, most students prefer that over looking at diagrams and stuff. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and prepare our machine for React development and talk about some of the tools involved. All right, so in this video, I just want to go over our environment and what you're going to need to use to start building React applications. And it's not much. React is a client-side JavaScript framework, so we don't need too much. But there are a couple things that we need. So one is going to be Node.js. You want to install that on your machine. And the reason for that is, well, a couple of reasons. One, because we need NPM, which is the Node Package Manager. We're going to be using that to set up Create React App, which is a command line tool to basically give us a boilerplate app to start with. And then we'll also have some third-party packages that we're going to need to install with NPM as well. And then in the 4th project, which I actually haven't finished yet, it will be a full stack MERN project. MERN is MongoDB, Express, React, and Node.js. So you will need it for that as well. And as far as the version goes, I would recommend the long-term support version. And this will probably be different depending on when you're watching this. Right now, I'm having some issues with version 17. So I would definitely suggest, if you're watching this soon after I create this course, to use version 16. So next, you're going to need a text editor, and you can use whatever you want. I would recommend, and I use Visual Studio Code. I think that it has great features, it's fast, it's intuitive, there's great extensions, which I'm also going to go over in this video. So that's what I would recommend, but of course, if you want to use Sublime or Atom or something else, that's absolutely fine as well. So next, you want to have Git installed on your machine. You should be using version control. You should be making Git commits throughout this course. I'm not going to be doing my commits on screen, but I will be doing them behind the scenes. And you'll also need it to deploy, because later on we're going to deploy to Vercel and to Netlify, and you need to have a Git repository in order to do that. So definitely get that installed. And if you're on Windows, at least for me, when I use Windows, I like to use the Git Bash terminal, which you can also get here as well. This is git-scm.com. And it gives you a more Unix-like terminal. Or, of course, you could use the Windows subsystem for Linux. You probably already have your development environment set up, but that's just what I would recommend. And then the React developer tools for either Chrome or Firefox, I would definitely recommend those. We're going to use it throughout the course to basically view our state and some of the components in our component tree and so on. So I definitely get that installed as well. And then Postman is an HTTP client that we'll be using throughout the course, and it's just used to make HTTP requests to either your own backend or to a third-party API. All right, so that's pretty much it as far as tools and software. Now I just want to go over some of the VS Code extensions that I have and how I have my configuration. So we'll start with the configuration. I'm just going to open up my settings here, my JSON settings, so you guys can see. And I don't have a crazy setup. Since I do tutorials and courses, I like to keep things pretty vanilla. But I beefed up the font size for the editor, for the terminal. I have word wrap on. I do use single quotes, so even if I put double quotes in, I use prettier, which will then remove the double quotes and put single quotes in. I also don't use semicolons. Some people don't like that, but I prefer not to use them. And in no way am I saying you shouldn't use them or you should use single quotes. It's all preference, right? Everyone has their own preference. But in my code, it will be single quotes and no semicolons. And then, let's see, I don't think any of this other stuff really matters. Right here, so if you're using Emmet, I think you have to add this in included languages if you want Emmet to work in JSX, in React. And then, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So not too much. Tab size I've set to 2, but you can use your own settings. I just wanted to show you what I'm using. All right, so let's look at some of the extensions that I'm using. So the first one that I would say that I would kind of recommend is the ES7 React Redux snippets, and this allows us to quickly generate components, functional components, which is what we'll be using. So I would recommend installing that. Bracket pair colorizer is also a great extension that I really like. It'll just colorize your curly braces, your parentheses, and your square brackets, and it will make them the same color so that you know where your if statements end and your functions and so on. As for my theme, I'm using the GitHub dark theme, or I think it's the GitHub dark, and then I selected dim. Let me just check that. So theme, no, it's just the dark, GitHub dark. So, and of course I'm not telling you should change your theme, I'm just letting you know. And then I have the JavaScript ES6 code snippets, which I don't use that much, but I do use like CLG for console log, things like that, try catch. What else? Prettier, which I use to format my code. And that's pretty much it. VS Code icons. None of this other stuff really matters for this course or for React development, but I just wanted to let you know what I'm using so it doesn't confuse anybody later on. All right, so I think we're ready to get started. In the next video, I just want to show you the repositories for the projects for this course. Hey guys, I just wanted to quickly go over the code for this course and for the projects. So I have everything in its own GitHub repository for all the projects, the 3 that are already in the course, and I'll have the 4th one later on. And I'll have a document in the course that has all the links as well. So as you can see, this is the repository for the feedback app. And if you want, you can go to the commits. And I didn't make a commit for every single video, but I made a commit after everything we did that was pretty significant. Like if you wanted to see where we created the feedback stats component, or when we added the add feedback functionality, you can just come to one of these commits and you'll see the exact code that was added or changed. Okay, so that's the feedback app. Then we have the GitHub Finder app. Now this I do actually have, I have another repo that's just called GitHub Finder. For now, this I'm going to leave that up, and the newer one is GitHub Finder app. So just look in the description here and you should see that it's part of the React Front to Back 2022 course. All right, so that's that. Then we have the House Marketplace app. This is the Firebase app, the larger project that we do in the course. And then I also have some GIS. You can just search for Brad Traversy GIS and you'll get this page here. And we have the Firebase setup for the House Marketplace, just kind of some steps that we follow through. And then also the Firebase rules, because we do have to add some rules in order to add permissions so that you have to be authenticated, for instance, to create a new listing and things like that. And I talk about this more when the time comes, when we get into that project. And then anything else that you need, like there are some assets like images and so on. In that particular video or in that section, I will have a zip file that you can download to get those resources.